Well, you are now, whether you were or not before. But I want to really tell you how much I appreciate your coming, because I realize anybody with kids, your lives are busy. You have things to do. You have everything from homework to get done, to meals to be prepared, and baths to be taken, and bedtimes to be met. And how grateful I am for your being here tonight. And I want to say, I look forward just to an exchange. We're going to spend most of our time here tonight just letting you ask questions. But because it's primarily a group of homeschoolers, rather than talk about all of the issues all over the waterfront, I want to focus primarily on some of the issues of education, because I do think it's important. Let me say the first thing, because one of the questions I get asked a lot of times is, as president, what would you do about education? And I think people are surprised when my first response is, as president, there's not much I would do about education, because education is not a federal responsibility. So let's go. Now, when I was governor, I had a lot of responsibilities about education, because in my state, our state constitution made the state the primary responsible entity for education standards, education results, education funding. And it became very much a part of my life. In fact, 70% of our general revenue dollars in the state of Arkansas were for education. I could go on to tell you that 91% of all of the general revenue dollars in the state went for three things: education, Medicaid, and prisons. I used to tell people that as governor, there were three big responsibilities I had: educate, Medicaid, incarcerate. That basically was the gamut, and everything else fell within the last 9% of the general revenue budget. And there were a lot of other things that fell into that, and other things were federally funded. But education occupied the biggest chunk out of the state budget. And I'm guessing, I don't know the exact figures in Iowa, but I'm guessing that in your state it's probably a lot the same. I don't think the federal government ought to be getting involved in the decisions that you, as a family, need to make first and foremost about education. And if in the state of Iowa, your state law puts education really at the forefront of the state government, then that's where it should be. If it's local school boards in partnership with the state, that's fine. But ultimately, education decisions, even in a state, still are ultimately the responsibility, first and foremost, of mom and dad. Because the number one, really, I think, center of education is the home. Most of us, before we ever show up to a formal education, if we should go to a public school or a private school, assuming we're not homeschooled, but every form of education really begins first and foremost in our own homes. That's where we learn to share. That's where we learn basic manners. It's where we learn to wait our turn. It's where we learn that there is a schedule that we have to meet. Is this thing going to bite me? Will it hurt me? Okay. I've gone fishing with things less intrusive than that, so I just want to know. Put a line on it, cast it on my because you're going to get awfully tired. Do you not want to sit over here somewhere? Okay. Because if you can handle this all night, I'm going to see this. This is going to be cool. I'm really going to be impressed. Yes, but you weren't this afraid to get close to me 8 years ago. I wasn't that frightening or something, because I remember you didn't have to hold a microphone on a stick 6 feet away. If that's okay, I'm fine with it. I really am. I just don't want you to get tired. All right, I'm going to take, how many of you think she can last 15 minutes? I think she may go the distance just to see if I can handle it. Well, education is ultimately a mom and dad decision, because it is the home, which is the foundation institution that God created. And of all the institutions that God honors, that God created, that we have a part of our overall society, the most important one is still our family, our home. And it is there that even if a kid goes on to public school or any other form of education, the primary, basic, fundamental lessons of his or her life are still going to be the ones learned at home. Many of you have made a very major decision. You've made the decision to educate your children at home. As mom and dad, you're not only the mother and the father, but you're also the teacher. And I've always believed that there are very few sacrifices a parent can make that are as great as the sacrifice to homeschool. Dan and I have very close friends, Rick and John Caldwell in Little Rock. college classmates of ours. Rick performed our wedding, in fact. He was my college roommate. He now works with an organization called Men's Fraternity, and a lot of people around the country may be familiar with Men's Fraternity. Rick is the one, he's the CEO of that organization. It was started by Robert Lewis, who is a good friend of mine. He used to come to the governor's mansion every week for a prayer group that we had. But Rick now operates primarily the role of Men's Fraternity. It's a great group. But just to sort of put this in perspective, Rick and his wife, Jonelle, were two of the first people that we knew who made the decision to homeschool their kids. And, you know, it was still pretty new. I mean, this was 35 years ago, 34, 36 years ago, something like that. And so, you know, there were very few people homeschooling their children in Arkansas at that time. They were very, very good at it, very effective at it. Their kids turned out great. Their son worked for me in the 2008 campaign. And Aubrey's over here. We called her Cheeto for reasons that make no sense to anybody except those that worked in the campaign. Everybody had a nickname. But his nickname was Lunchbox. You remember, of course, she worked with him many a day here in Iowa. Let me say that when I was governor, one of my first appointments was to the State Board of Education. And my first appointment to the State Board of Education was historic for a couple of reasons. One, because it was my first appointment to the State Board of Education. And the other was because the appointee was, in fact, Jonelle, who became the first homeschool parent in the United States of America to ever be appointed to a State Board of Education. I felt that was important, not because I knew her, but because I felt that homeschooling parents were not being given an adequate voice in the entire discussion of education. As governor, we fought to relax any type of restrictions or any type of requirements on the part of parents because, quite frankly, the state really had no reason to want to legislate and regulate homeschool parents. They weren't our responsibility. They weren't our problem. We had more than to say grace over with the public schools. And yet there were times when there were people within the public community, and especially on the left, who wanted the state to have a bigger role in regulating homeschools. Well, that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So one of the ways that I was able to fight that was to put a homeschool parent on the state board. And Jonelle became the first ever in the entire United States homeschool mom or homeschool parent on a State Board of Education. When she was appointed to the board, I will be honest with you, there was such a pushback. Oh, people were just furious and angry. I'm sure that surprises a lot of you. Have you ever had a homeschool parent on the Iowa School Board, Iowa State Board? No. Don't think so? Okay. Well, people were upset, number one, because they said, you know, play the game, you don't make any rules. I said, well, then don't make any rules for these folks, because there's like 13,000 homeschool parents in our state, and they really don't need to be regulated by us. And one of the ways to protect them is to make sure that somebody's there looking after their interests. She turned out to be one of the best board members we ever had, period, because she brought a fresh perspective. Her mother had been a career teacher in the public schools. When she would go to a legislative committee hearing, this is just a little anecdote you'll find interesting, all of the other board members tried to look over her shoulder to see what notes she was making. Well, Jonelle is extremely fluent in Spanish, and so she took all her notes in Spanish so none of the other board members could actually know what she was saying. It just really messed them up. It was terrific. Well, fast forward on now to the fact that there are three things that I think are important in education, whether it's homeschool, whether it's public school, private school. And that is that you have the highest possible standards. You never want to dumb down an educational standard. You want to lift up the standards, make it so that it's challenging and rigorous. The second thing is you want to measure. You want to find out, are we hitting the standards? Are we making progress? And the third thing is that you have accountability. In the case of homeschooling, accountability is mom and dad saying, are we doing a good job? In the public schools, it's whether or not these kids are actually performing and whether they're achieving according to the standard. I know there's some people who would say, let's not have a bunch of testing, and I would agree that it can easily morph into over-testing, which is one of the reasons that Common Core has become such a disastrous failure, is because it it ultimately devolved down into a testing game rather than really just doing setting of standards in math and in language arts. But for the same reason that we keep score at a football game, there has to be some measurement. And you measure in a homeschool environment every day, and you measure as to whether or not your students are ready to meet the next grade level. One of the things that's always amazed me is most homeschool students do so much better than do most of the kids in the public schools because they're not on a strict academic calendar, and the student actually progresses at the point at which he or she is achieving rather than waiting to go at the speed of the slowest people in the class. And if the student is able to move on to the next letter grade by January, they're able to do that rather than just having to sit there and be bored for 4 months while the rest of the kids catch up on an academic calendar that really doesn't make a lot of sense. I knew we'd get you over here. Interestingly enough, one of the things that rankled some of the left in our state the most was when the only and the first perfect score on the SAT of 3,600 was achieved was on the part of a homeschooler, a young lady whose father worked for me in the Department of Human Services. And there was no small angst out there in the public school world, because the first time that anybody had ever absolutely aced completely 100% the entire SAT score was a homeschool student who did it, by the way, when she was 16 years old. So that was pretty significant, and it was a great affirmation that homeschoolers were not suffering academically, to be sure. I want to spend the time talking about the things that are of great interest to you and to your families. And so rather than me give what I would normally do would be the campaign stump speech, let me just open for questions, because I realize that our time here is limited. And as I like to say in the South, we want to scratch where there's the itch. So you tell me where the questions are, and let's spend our time tonight on the things that matter most to you. Whether it's education, and it could be something else if you want it to be. Oh, you got a microphone. Okay, great. So she will bring a microphone to you so that way everyone can hear the question. That's a little disappointing to have that, because you know, one of the things I like is when you don't have a microphone. That way I assume people don't hear the question. I'm the only one who does. And that way I can make the question whatever I want it to be. It really lightens it up for me. Okay, who has a question? Just raise your hand and she will get a microphone to you. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. Here we go, right here. Yes, sir. By the way, I just want you to know those Huck stickers on you, they really, they're a fashion statement. Yes, sir.
I have a quick question. My name's Jeremy Walters. I'm from Madrid, Iowa, Boone County. Common Core is pretty strict in our school district, and I do have a daughter that's 6 years old. She's in first grade. I don't like it because we treat them like they're numbers. They're a passer or a failure. Mm-hmm. And we, as parents at the public school board meetings almost every month or every other month to get more updates on this Common Core. They're testing, they just test for reading everything, and they're trying to tell me my daughter is not up to core, you know, with the numbers. So she has to go and get tutored within the school. My question for you is, I know that I would like to do homeschooling, but I don't know where to start. My thing is, and another question is, you know, as homeschoolers in here, I know they're homeowners as well. I don't believe that they should be paying property taxes to the public schools if they're homeschooled. What do you think about that? Go.
Let me address, first of all, I think Common Core has become such a monstrous failure that most states have now abandoned it, and for good cause, because what started out to be a way to keep the federal government out of education became a way in which the federal government got way too involved in education, and it has been disastrous. And there has been such a expansion, which originally Common Core was the states, not the federal government. The federal government had nothing to do with it. states were going to create standards in 2 areas, math and language arts. And it was mainly so that if a student moved from one state to the other, there would be some semblance of comparable standards that the student would face in those areas. It had nothing to do with curriculum. There was nothing whatsoever about curriculum, certainly nothing about things like data collection. And over the period of time, especially when the federal government decided, hey, this is a great Trojan horse for us to get in the middle of it, we can just go right into education, we can expand it into other topics, and we can expand it into designing what the curriculum looks like, and tie funding to it, and get data collected on students. And it is one of the most controversial, and I think universally hated ideas in education that's come along in my lifetime. Interestingly enough, people on the left hate it as much as people on the right. It's universally loathed, especially by parents. And maybe the only people who hate it more than parents are teachers. My sister virtually retired after 34 years of teaching because she just was up to here with the Common Core stuff that they were forcing on her as a school teacher in Arkansas. So I believe it's probably one of the best things that ever happened to homeschooling. There's a lot of parents who have been utterly frustrated with what has been forced on their children in a or in a public school environment because of Common Core have decided to homeschool. As far as how you get started, I'm probably not the best person to answer. We've got a room full of them. And I'm guessing that in Iowa, like it is in Arkansas, Arkansas has a homeschool association. And there are so many parents that are willing to help and mentor and share and help. And I'm sure that's true here in Iowa. I don't live here, so I can't attest to that. But I do know there's a very active homeschool association here, because I've spoken to it before. And my guess is that when this is over, there's going to be about 5 people come over to you and say, here's my contact information, call me, I'll help you get started. I don't think that'll be a problem. The other part of your question really dealt with taxes, which is more of a state issue. It's not a federal. So the President of the United States has nothing to do with determining whether you should have to pay property tax. It is a part of the bigger discussion. If a parent takes his or her children out of the public school system and therefore is not receiving those resources, should there be some type of credit given? If not a direct credit, and here's why you don't want that. If it's a direct credit in the form of a voucher, in the form of some type of payment where the government sends you money, just remember, with government money comes government control. And I'm just thinking you don't want that. Because the last thing you want to do is be a homeschool parent that has the government telling you what you can teach your kids and what you can't. And many people homeschool because of the spiritual quality of being able to educate in Christian values and Christian truth. And the government would probably say, nix on that. And so I think that would be the last thing most homeschool parents would want. I've heard a variety of things suggested, everything from tax credits, but ultimately it's a decision that I think you, the people of Iowa, local school board, you'll have to work that out. The one thing I would absolutely say to you, you don't want the federal government getting involved in the question, because the answer will never be a good answer. That I'm certain of. Let me just say, in a bigger way, the next president had better take seriously the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. It's pretty explicit. If it's not written in the Constitution, it's supposed to be the domain of the states. And we have the federal government doing a lot of things that it has no business doing, it has no authority in which to do. And it's not just in education. A lot of it has to do with environmental regulation. Some of it has to do with even everything from how we operate prisons and corrections facilities. The federal government has put its hands and fingers all over aspects of our lives. And if you read the Constitution, it has no business doing it, including defining marriage, which it has no business doing either. And I don't believe that the Supreme Court had the authority to do what it did, and states should routinely ignore it anyway. Okay. Who else? And we'll get the microphone to you. Yes, sir. Right back here. I can see you because that shirt's easy to find. I like that. I just want to clarify, that's not a Tennessee orange, is it? Okay, because Arkansas beat Tennessee last Saturday, and I just wanted to make sure that if that were Tennessee orange, I was going to give you the business in a real bad way. I'm messing with you. Go ahead.
What do you think about the UN rights of a child?
The UN, sorry?
The UN rights of the child?
Well, the UN rights of the child. Once again, the UN has no business dictating anything for America, and what I've seen of the so-called rights of the child is basically a way for the government to take parental authority away from moms and dads. And let me be real clear. It wouldn't hurt my feelings at all if somebody took a jackhammer and just sliced off the UN, floated it off into the East River, and let any country in the world host it that wanted it, because I've given up any real sense that it has a significant purpose other than to spend a whole lot of taxpayers' money sitting around and getting nothing done and supporting terrorists and crazy people at the expense of supporting decent governments and responsible governments. But, okay. Who's next?
We do have one more question, Governor.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar, when he was talking about the UN,
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the International Baccalaureate program.
The
International Baccalaureate program. They call it IB program.
I can't say that I am.
Well, right now, the Des Moines School District here has implanted, and it's been that way for about 6 years now. They're spending almost over $1 million a year to have this program at the central campus. And what it does, it takes away American history, and it basically, the IB program is part of the United Nations. And I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am not, and
It takes
that's
away.
in Des Moines?
Yes, at the central campus. And
Yes.
it takes away American history and puts in world history, and they don't concentrate on, who founded this country. Basically, it's more like a one government education program.
Well, I would say there's a need for some parents in Des Moines to rise up and scream bloody murder. I can't imagine that. I don't understand why anyone would not want to have a good dose of American history if they want to live in America. My statement about history is real simple. History is to the society what the memory is to the individual. I want you to think about something. If you woke up tomorrow and you did not know your name, you had no idea why you were living in this particular house, those people that just showed up at a table to eat something called breakfast, you didn't know who they were, even though they were your family. If you had no idea whether you had a job or whose clothes those were in the closet, I'm saying if you woke up and you had no memory at all, you complete amnesia, you think you would be a little lost and confused? Yeah, of course you would. You would be completely, absolutely unable to function. Now ask yourself this. If a society has no semblance of who it is, has no idea of where it has come from, how it came to be, does it make sense that that society will be utterly confused and bumfuzzled about who it is and where it's come from? So history is to the culture and to the society what the memory is to the individual. And it's so very important that we know our history and that we know the truth of our history. And that we understand something about who these people were that created this incredible experiment government called the United States of America. Look, I'm convinced that a lot of people running for president have no idea a whole lot about America. Because they act like that there really is only one branch of government, the judicial. And that when it decides something, it's the law of the land. You ever heard that one before? Well, where did they come up with that? Did they get it from the Constitution? They most certainly did not. Because if they read the Constitution, they would know that our founders were really brilliant. I mean, I think they were more brilliant than we give them credit for. And if we would go back and understand our history, here's what we would learn. That our founders recognized something that most of us who go to church recognize, and that is that we have a basic nature that is a nature of sin. I know that's not very popular to say. It's politically incorrect. And when you say somebody is a sinner, and I would say, I'm a sinner, I would imagine most of you would say you're sinners. The Bible says we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's none of us righteous, no, not one. And that doesn't mean we're all mass murderers. It just means that we all have a natural bent towards self-interest. Best definition of sin is little s, little n, and a great big I in the middle. All about me. And the point of being a sinner is that left to ourselves, we will tend to try to get away with whatever we can get away with. Now, if you don't believe that, let your kid do whatever he or she wants to do. Never correct them. Never tell them no. Whatever they feel, just believe it's about their creativity and their right to be who they want to be. And you're going to raise a monster. I don't mean to say anybody here has a monster, but if you have no boundaries for your kids, if they can go to sleep whenever they want, get up when they want, not get up at all, go to school if they want, not go to sleep if they don't want to, eat candy for breakfast, candy for lunch, candy for dinner, never brush their teeth, never comb their hair, never take a bath, come in out of the yard only when they couldn't feel like it. I mean, if you have a 6-year-old who behaves like that, none of us want to be around you or the kid. I'm just telling you that right now. Why? Because you're completely out of control. I'm saying that because, look, all of us here accept that there are boundaries in life. There are things we have to do in order to have some sense of order to our community. Here's what worries me when I think about some of the challenges that we face in a world where we don't hear about our history. Our founders understood that we were frail, that we were sinners, that left to ourselves we would be corrupted. And so they built a government that took that into account. And so they made not one, not two, but 3 branches. And the purpose of the 3 branches was to give balance. There were 3 equal branches. None was more powerful than the other. Each had a role to play, and each were there in a separate power, equal and accountable. The key is accountable because there are checks and balances built into our system of government. Of all the issues that we face in the coming presidential administration, I think none are as fundamentally as important as a president who understands that simple constitutional separation of powers, balance of powers, and checks and balances. A president who will say, look, the court is certainly free to render a ruling, but it is not law because only the people's representatives can make the law. And this nonsense that we just have to roll over and accept judicial tyranny, that's a dereliction of duty on the other 2 parts, the other 2 branches of government. And I'm coming to all of that to say about history. If we don't know who we are and where we've come from, we end up with a country like we have now where people will accept judicial tyranny without even questioning it because they've never actually read the Constitution. They've only heard what someone said about it, and that someone was wrong. Okay, question here in the back. Yes.
So understanding the 3 different branches, as president, what would you do to take care of the other 2 branches that aren't operating correctly, like the Supreme Court making laws, which that is not their function? What would a president like yourself, if you were elected, do to make sure that the American people do understand how our government was set up and how it should run?
Well, let's take an example in the same-sex marriage case. What a president should do is to thank the Supreme Court for coming up with a ruling and say, we appreciate it, but we can find nothing in the Constitution that says that you have the right to redefine marriage. And since that language isn't there, we can't enforce it unless the people's representatives, the members of Congress, decide to vote on such a definition and agree to that. And if they do, then it has to come to my desk for signature. And if something of that nature comes, since it's not in the Constitution, I would be constitutionally obligated to veto it. And then the Congress could override the veto if they had the votes to do it. And then I would decide whether I would enforce it. And if I decided not to enforce it, then they have the right to impeach me, because that's their check and balance if they think I'm out of control. But the point is, we have a very thorough, thoughtful system in which each branch checks and balances the other. The one thing we don't have is one branch just saying, this is what it's going to be, and the other 2 bowing down and all but worshiping it and saying, yes, we accept that. And that's why Thomas Jefferson said that if we allow the Supreme Court to make decisions that we just roll over and follow, Jefferson said that would be judicial tyranny, and he said that then we turn the Constitution into, as he said, a thing of wax. Excuse me. I've never been blessed so many times today. So that's what you do. And you also make sure that where the Constitution is crystal clear, you follow it. Let me give an example. And I'm waiting on somebody else who's running for president to join me in this declaration. That the Constitution is crystal clear in the 5th and 14th Amendment that every human being has a basic right of due process before you can deprive them of life or liberty. You read that, right? 5th Amendment. 14th Amendment extends it to the states. Equal protection under the law. So here's a question. Is an unborn child a human being?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Because if it's a human being, if the unborn child is a person, then it is entitled to protection under the 5th and 14th Amendment. It is not a matter of having, I hear people say, I will introduce a constitutional amendment. Well, big whoopee deal. That's happy talk. Forget that. I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine, but you don't have to. You already have existing language in the Constitution that protects every person. Now, we can argue over whether the unborn child is a person. That's an argument. But you can't argue whether, if it is a person, it's due protection. So as president, I would believe, practice, and implement the notion that every unborn child is in fact a person, in part because at one end of the hallway of a Planned Parenthood clinic, you have a mother being told it's nothing more than a blob of tissue. Now she is told that as that baby is being extracted from her. But right down the hall, the parts of that baby are carried and sold off in pieces as body parts, brains, liver, heart, kidneys. Well, that's not a blob of tissue there, is it? I mean, blobs of tissue don't have hearts and brains, and livers, kidneys. Babies do, people do. I think we've made this all wrong. We've made this where we're on the defensive and we're spending all of our time and effort going to court trying to save a baby. I think we ought to turn it on its head and make the pro-abortionists fight us in court for the right to take the baby's life. And let's make them define what due process looks like and why it is that that's not a human being. And so that would be my approach, which I think is the approach we should have been taking all along. We've pretended that the Supreme Court could have created some right. They really can't. And most importantly, we have acquiesced to that notion that the Supreme Court is to just be blindly followed, even if it means the destruction and deaths of 60 million unborn human beings. Okay, I have one here in the front. All right, the question is, and we didn't have a mic, but I'll just repeat it. Am I saying that because the Supreme Court made a decision that what put through Congress, that it's really not a law? It's not a law because the Supreme Court can't legislate. I mean, let's go back to the language of the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear. Only Congress can pass a law and legislate. Any bill, any law has to originate there. The Supreme Court can't make one up. I know we've talked about, well, the court shouldn't legislate. The truth is, it's not just that they shouldn't, they cannot. The only reason that they have been getting away with it is because no one in either of the other two branches of the government ever rose up and fulfilled their constitutional duty to say, you can't do that. That's why we continue to have to. So, an illustration I like to tell is one that I could personally relate to. When I was governor, we had a Supreme Court case on school funding. School finance in Arkansas was deemed unconstitutional. It was a case that wound its way through the courts for 20 years. First got started back in the early part of Bill Clinton's tenure as governor, and it had been in the courts just forever. And the Supreme Court came out with a decision in late November 2002, right after the 2002 election. I'd just been reelected as governor. So the Supreme Court comes down and says that school funding in Arkansas was unconstitutional, both on the grounds that it was inequitable and inadequate. I read the decision, I had the Constitution, and quite frankly, the court was right. According to our Constitution, And according to the way we finance schools, we weren't equitable and we weren't adequate for all the schools having an amount of funding that would be comparable to bring that equity. So here's my point. I didn't just order the Department of Education the very next day to start writing new checks to school districts. Why didn't I do that? Because I didn't have the legal authority. Because the legislature had the power of the purse and they had to determine the allocations and the appropriations. Once they did that and I signed it, then I had the power to send those checks. But that required a legislative session. That required an agreement of the House and the Senate and the governor, a signature of the governor, and then an order from the governor to the Department of Education. The court could not just tell the Department of Education, send some new checks out, because the court didn't have the authority. I'll give you one further. When the court made the ruling, I didn't want to spend all this time in a 90% Democrat legislature fighting through this incredibly complex political issue, only to have the court say, well, thanks, you tried, but you didn't get it right, it's still not constitutional. So I, in good faith, said to the court, well, if we're not constitutional, would you tell us what it would look like if it were? And here's their answer. They said, no, we can't do that, because that would be legislating. We don't have the authority or the power to do that. It's our job to tell you it's unconstitutional. It's your job to figure out how to make it constitutional, and that's what the legislature's for. Now, to be honest with you, there's so much more advanced in the U.S. Supreme Court that I look back in awe and I say, I'm so glad those guys had actually read the Arkansas Constitution and they understood it. I wish the U.S. Supreme Court had done the same, or at least 5 of the lawyers I wish they had. Now, just to close this out, and then I'll go to another question. Folks, this notion that the court makes a decision and we just immediately surrender to it, that is, as Jefferson called, judicial tyranny. It's when we are completely under the rule, not of elected representatives as was intended, but then we are simply under the rule of, as John Roberts called them, 5 unelected lawyers. What a disaster that is for the country.
I was just curious, a lot of my friends who are believers are supporting Ben Carson. And I was curious if you have any way that you differentiate yourself from him as your policy, as a candidate, as a Christian.
Well, look, Dr. Carson is a wonderful human being, and I have nothing but respect for him. I know him. We've done some conference programs together over the last several years. He and his wife, Candy, are nothing more than delightful, lovely, and just brilliant people. And Dr. Carson's probably one of the smartest people that I personally know. And his skill as a neurosurgeon, unparalleled. I wouldn't want to try to contrast and say, look, here's, I wouldn't want to say, I'm better than Ben Carson. I certainly can't do neurosurgery. I would only say that I believe that the totality of my life experience prepares me to be president. I believe that having served as a chief executive of a government over an extended period of time in the most hostile environment in America, a culture that was totally dominated by the Clintonistas, is a great preparation to run in the election and then to govern. I don't think the presidency is an entry-level job. I don't think the presidency is a political position that is the easiest thing in the world to start out with. And I think even the smartest person in the room will have a difficult time adjusting to the nuances of how to govern because it is a different environment. Now, I've never served in Washington, so this stuff, well, we need an outsider. Folks, you don't get much more of an outsider than me. I was an outsider in my own state, but I've never had a paycheck from Washington, never ever had a job there, never lived there. So I'm totally outsider when it comes to that, but I do understand how to govern. There's no job that better prepares one to be president than governor for this reason. When you are a governor, you manage a microcosm of the federal government. Every agency that exists at the federal level, you have an identical agency at the state level. So you understand the full field of play. Let me contrast with a legislator, not just Ben Carson. Good people. In some cases have some very specific skill sets. But if you're a legislator, you're going to serve on maybe 3 committees, and you're going to be very well versed on the areas of which you're totally connected to, your committees. But you won't see how all those things integrate together because that's not the nature of a legislature. If you're a governor, you have to see all of the agencies, all of the various functions of government, and how they integrate and intertwine, and you have to manage those in a way that collectively brings out the best form of governing and managing the budget that can be. And I think that that's a plus. Knowing something about that, I believe is important. I was a CEO of a private company, several of them in fact, CEO of a nonprofit organization, CEO of a government. They're totally different in all three areas. And the biggest difference in government is that you cannot fire the people that you work with. You may be the CEO of the government, but you can't fire the legislature. And you, for the most part, cannot even fire the bureaucracy because they have tenure and they have civil service protection, and there's not a doggone thing you can do about it except learn how to build relationships and work either with them, through them, around them, or hope to one day outlive them. But that's about the only options you've got. Yes, ma'am.
As an American citizen right now, personally, I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but going back to the checks and balances topic that you were discussing, I feel like the executive rules the judicial and the Congress is out there just on their own trying to figure it out. And that's the way I feel. I feel like it's totally unbalanced because the Congress is not being able to do anything. I may be wrong. This is just what this is my view. This is the way I see it. And I don't even want to use it anymore. So I just look on the news, my iPad or whatever. That's where I get my news, which is probably not good either. But, so I'm concerned about this. I've never seen our branches of government so unbalanced.
Yeah.
And this has been bothering me for years now, ever since I've noticed that. I feel like our executive is kind of telling the judicial what to do. And the Congress is sort of out there just, so tell me, is this the way it's going? Or is the judicial saying we're doing what we want to do and we're making these decisions? I feel like the influence is from the executive. And I feel like the Congress is just out here somewhere trying to stay above water.
If you didn't hear the question, she says she feels like the executive branch is sort of overrunning the judicial and the Congress is sort of out there all on their own, not doing much of anything. Let me quickly concur and say the Congress is out there on its own, not doing much of anything. It's one of the reasons we're all so angry. We're also frustrated with the Republican Congress. We work hard to get them elected. They go up there. We sent them there to be the backstop and really to put an end to the overreach of executive power on Obamacare and immigration and things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the trade deals, the Iranian deal. And lo and behold, the Republican Congress go along with it. And in fact, in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and in the case of the Iranian deal, they virtually hand Obama more power. I don't understand it. And it's made a lot of us, including me, very, very unhappy. I don't think that the executive branch has given over power so much to the judicial in this administration because this particular president believes there is no power higher than him. And he has completely operated on his own. He said he has a pen and a phone, and he somehow thinks that's more important than having a constitution that should regulate him. But the reason he keeps doing that is not because he constitutionally can do it. It's because he can practically do it if the Congress won't do anything to stop it. Now, if you wonder, well, what can they do? Folks, the Congress has the power of the purse. The president has the power of the sword, but the Congress has the power of the purse, and what they can do is to shut off funding. If the president wants to go out there and say, we're going to allow, let's say, illegal immigration to continue, he can just, the Congress can go and say, okay, we're going to close funding to the operation of the White House. We will close funding to the Department of Homeland Security. We will close out the funding to the branch of the Air Force that flies Air Force One. You'll have to stay in Washington. I mean, there are a lot of things they can do. Now, you might ask, why don't they do it? I'll tell you why. Because the same donors who give to Democrats give to Republicans, and frankly, as long as they're making money, they don't care what happens to you or to me or to a large measure the country at large. It's all about protecting the special interest, and that's why we don't see a whole lot of difference depending on who's running the show. And it's very frustrating. I'll go back to my original point. People get away with doing whatever they can get away with doing until somebody tells them they can't, and somebody with the authority tells them they can't. So if a president is using the executive branch and is overreaching, that president will continue to do it and only expand it until one of the other two branches says, you can't do that. And if they don't exercise their constitutional duty to do that, we're going to see more of it. And if the Congress lays down and says whatever he wants, he wins, we're going to get more of it. If the president lays down and lets the court make a ruling and doesn't challenge it, and if the Congress doesn't challenge it, it stands. It stands not because it's true, it's not because it's valid, it's not because it's a right decision, it stands because there's nobody to challenge it. It's why the elections matter. Because if you elect people who don't take seriously their part of the government, this is what we end up with. By the way, I'll offer my own opinion as to why would it be that folks like in Congress don't challenge court rulings. I'll tell you why. Nobody wants to be unpopular. And a lot of times politicians don't want to take a stand that makes them accountable for the decision. It's easy for them to hide under the skirt of the Supreme Court robes and say, you know what, there's just nothing we can do about this law of the land. That's easier than saying, no, we don't agree with that, and we're not going to vote for that. Okay, real quick follow-up, and then I got some other folks.
Do you think that limits on congressional seats will help that?
I totally believe in term limits for members not only of Congress, we already have it in the executive branch. I think we ought to have term limits for members of the judicial branch as well, all federal judges and the Supreme Court justices.
Obviously, you're probably aware of what happened in Oklahoma with the have to take down the 10 Commandments from a public building. I just want you to comment on that. You know, we hear a lot of rhetoric. I think I addressed it somewhat vaguely, but to clarify, we keep hearing from Republican candidates, we're going to get rid of the Department of Education. I just wanted to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan said he would get rid of it, and he didn't, and every Republican president has said it. And it's never easy to get rid of a federal agency because it requires both houses of Congress being willing to do it. There are a lot of patrons who depend upon funding, and so therefore it has a lot of champions. But I mean, I think every president has to try to get rid of some of these agencies. Number one, and not do it in the sense just of budget control. See, I think one of the mistakes we make is we make it all about the budget. Budget is one factor, but the other factor is we ought to make it on the basis of the 10th Amendment. We ought to just say, look, we've read through here, and unless somebody can tell us that the federal government has a specific role in education, then we should not have a federal agency that deals with it. And we should devolve that power back to the states. Because I was a governor for so long, I said this at the last CNN debate. I don't know if you were still awake when I finally got around to getting the question. I was barely awake. I had to be jolted awake. Just to remind myself that I was really there, not in a line at the DMV. But one of the things that I just feel like we're missing, as a governor, one of my biggest battles wasn't just with the 90% Democratic legislature or a very liberal press. The biggest battle I had every day was with the federal government. Because the federal government tried to make all the decisions as to what would happen in our own states. Folks, we could do a lot of things differently in healthcare, education, even in corrections, road building. You'd be amazed at what could happen if we weren't having to constantly deal with the overreach of the federal government. And I'll be honest, it wasn't a whole lot better with Republican presidents than it was with Democrat presidents. I'd like to tell you that it was really different, but it wasn't. By the way, this is a little sort of an esoteric bit of history. Most people don't know this. Until the early 1900s, do you realize U.S. senators were not elected by the general population? In the original Constitution, senators were appointed by the state legislature. The big mistake we made was the 17th Amendment that provided for the direct election for senators. Now, I'm not thinking that's an easy fix, but I'm just telling you, here's why it was a mistake. The founders had it right. They understood that the popularly elected House of Representatives would be able to react to the passions and the thoughts of the people, but the senators, being appointed by the state legislature, would protect the 10th Amendment and protect the state's interests and would not let the federal government go out, obligate the states for a bunch of money, obligate the states for a bunch of regulation because they knew that they would have to go home and face the entity that appointed them, the state legislature. So there was an incredible balance there between the Senate and the House. Then it was thought, well, we ought to elect these senators. Sounds like a great idea. After all, don't let them be appointed by these political bodies. But the net result was, and I can tell you this from the personal experience of being a governor, the senators didn't care about what was happening in our state. They cared about what was happening in Washington. They didn't care what the impact was on the state budget. They cared about how it was going to affect the federal budget. And so did the House members. And so even it didn't matter Democrat or Republican, their interests were very different. They were Washington interests, not Arkansas interests. And that's just the way it flows. And it's been one of the reasons we've had so many federal overreaches through the time. Okay, I'm going to take one more question. And let's see, I'll let you have it right down here.
I was wondering about,
There you go.
I was actually going to ask about your feelings on America turning its back on Israel and Iran's nuclear deal, which could ultimately destroy Israel.
The mistake that we have made in the Middle East regarding Iran is catastrophic. Catastrophic. I read the entire agreement. It's 159 pages. You ought to read it. It doesn't take that long. There's several dozen pages, nothing more than listing all the people to get some of their money back from frozen assets, which really may give you a real clue as to why we did this agreement. Maybe more about the money than it is about, because it brings some semblance of sanity to the Middle East. But I believe this will prove to be the biggest disaster. A couple of things just right off the top. As recently as 2013, both John Kerry and President Obama both said that we would not enter into an agreement that did not completely dismantle the nuclear program of Iran. Well, they threw that out the window, and now Iran gets to continue a nuclear program. They just get to delay it for a while. We said that we would insist on anytime, anywhere inspections. That got thrown completely out. And now the inspections require a 24-day advance notice, and there's some areas completely off limits to inspection by the U.S., only by some phony baloney UN entity that will get to go in and poke around, and I'm sure they will be given full access. All of this was lunacy. And it is making a deal with people who, even as the deal was being made, were chanting death to America and declaring they'll wipe Israel off the face of the map. It's an irrational decision for us to enter into an agreement with people who have killed, kidnapped Americans, and who have funded the terror groups that have maimed our soldiers, killed our soldiers, and murdered a lot of innocent civilians all over the Middle East. Iran is the world's largest sponsor of terrorism. We just, in essence, have agreed to spend $150 billion helping to finance a terror organization. And what's really crazy, if you want to put that in U.S. terms, the economic impact of $150 billion in Iran is the equivalent of $5 trillion in the U.S. That's the kind of impact that it's going to have on their ability to function. Folks, this current administration cannot end soon enough for me. I don't say that just as a partisan because I'm a Republican. I say that because the policies that have been put into effect by this administration have long-term implications and create dangers for the world, the likes of which we have never seen before. And it is so important that we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and that we pray that God will hold any harm coming to them, and hopefully the next president, and if it's me, I'll promise you that it will be this way, that we will recognize who our real friends and allies are and who our real enemies are. Israel is our friend. Iran, its government, is not our friend. And I understand that. Unfortunately, President Obama does not. Okay, so I promised I'd get you guys out of here at a reasonable hour. I was going to keep you till 10 o'clock tonight, but I said I was told I couldn't do that. Let me say thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity to just have an informal visit with you. I would be remiss if I did not say to you, and put in a little plug, we're here to try to win the Iowa caucuses in February. I kind of think that's important to do. And I can't do that without you. And what I've asked people all over Iowa to do is to commit to help us in the caucuses, Get your friends, your relatives, your neighbors, people you work with to go with you to the caucuses, if they're going to vote for me. And if they are, I don't care how bad the weather is that night, we need you to get out, vote, and make sure I win Iowa again. 8 years ago, I got more votes than anyone in the history of the Iowa caucuses. But I'm not sitting around with my feet propped up thinking, well, they'll just all go out and vote for me again. That's why we're going to every one of the 99 counties. That's why I'm doing many events a day, just like today and tomorrow, and over, because I believe we have to earn every vote one at a time, all over again. And we're going to work hard. We're going to spend more time in Iowa than any other candidate because we know how important this is to us. Now, if you're going to vote for me, don't let anything keep you away that night. I don't care if there's 6 feet of snow on the ground. You've got to charter a helicopter to be lifted in. Now, if you have come to some conclusion, or if you do, some irrational idea that you're going to support someone else, I want to tell you something. You really should stay home that night and watch this on TV. Far too dangerous for you to get out there. And one other thing, many of you are wearing these little stickers that say Huck. We have some that say Huck, some that say Huck 16. I wanted to give you a little insight because I haven't told this to everybody. Just so you know, we are getting reports really from all over the country. People are putting those stickers on their cars, and we're getting reports that they are getting significantly better gas mileage when they put those on their cars. Now, I cannot guarantee or promise that that'll be your result. I want to give that disclaimer, but I do think it is worth a try. And I think you need to leave it on there for several months just to make sure it's had time to really work for you. And if by middle of February next year it has not really been effective, okay, then take it off. It didn't, but in the meantime, give it a shot and see. I mean, it's worth a try. You might go many, many miles further than you've ever gone before on a gallon of gasoline. And that will save you money. And yet there is another reason to vote for me in the Iowa caucuses. God bless you, guys, and thank you very much.